Josephine Tate rode up to the Merrill place on the last Tuesday in September of 1887 with her father 4 months in the ground and her brother's whole future strapped behind her saddle in a leather satchel. And she did not get down off the horse to say it. She said it from the saddle, in the yard, with the dust still settling, and the man standing in his own doorway in his shirt sleeves with a coffee cup in his hand. Josephine said, "Mr. Merrill, I have come about the notice you put up at the land office, and before you say one word to me, I want it plain between us, because I will not begin a thing like this on a lie. I am not here for you. I have never spoken 40 words to you in my life. I am here because you hold the Willow Spring quarter and the Willow Spring runs in August, and my father's outfit does not, and I have 2 brothers and a mortgage and until the 1st of April to save both. So if you meant that notice, I will marry you, and I will work, and I will keep your house and your books and never once complain of anything. But I am marrying the water, sir, that is the whole of it, and if you want a different sort of wife, you had better say so now, while I am still on this horse." And Cassius Merrill stood in that doorway and looked up at her for a long moment. And then he set his cup down on the porch rail, and he said, "Get down and come in, Miss Tate, and we will talk about the terms. And if it is any comfort to you, no, I do not want a different sort of wife. What I want you to notice is that he did not flinch, and he did not gush. He said one true thing and let her keep her dignity in the saddle. But I also want you to hold on to that pause, because it lasted a good deal longer than a pause needs to. And there was a reason for it that Josephine Tate would not learn for 6 months, and when she learned it, it very nearly ended them both. Josephine Tate was 31 years old. She had dark auburn hair that had gone brittle at the ends from 4 months of not caring about it, which she wore in a hard plait down her back like a girl, because there was nobody left at home to be respectable for. She had level gray eyes and sunburn across her nose and forearms from a summer of doing a man's work in the open, and her left little finger sat crooked at the middle joint from a fall off a windmill tower at 17 that had never been set properly, and she had a way of rubbing that crooked finger with her thumb when she was thinking, which she did not know she did, and which Cassius Merrill had noticed the first time he ever saw her. Nathaniel Tate had come into the Silvies River country in 1874 and built up 1,100 acres and a good house and a name, and had died in May of that year under a hay derrick that gave way, and had left behind 3 children, 412 head of cattle, a note at the Harney County Bank for $900, and a creek that had run every summer of the past 13 years and had not run one drop past the 15th of July that summer, because in March the Sagebrush Land and Cattle Company had put a diversion dam 11 miles upstream and taken it. That is the whole engine of this story, so let me be plain about it. In that country, in that year, land was worth precisely as much as the water on it, and not 1 cent more. A man could hold 1,100 acres of the best bunchgrass in Oregon and be a beggar by August if his creek went dry. And the Sagebrush Company knew it, and that was the business they were in. They did not steal land. They bought it cheap from men whose water they had taken, and it was entirely legal. And it was the most efficient cruelty ever devised in that part of the world. Emmett Tate was 19 and had his father's shoulders and none of his father's patience, and had spent that summer wanting to ride up and burn that diversion dam and having to be talked out of it about twice a week. Ozias Tate was 14 and small for it and had a stammer that came on him when he was frightened, which since May had been most of the time, and he had taken to sleeping in the barn with the horses because the house was too quiet with the old man gone. And Cassius Merrill was 38 and held 640 deeded acres on the bench above the Tate place, including the quarter section with Willow Spring on it, which came up out of a basalt shelf at a steady flow and had never in living memory gone dry in any month of any year. He was tall and lean and black-haired, with a streak of gray coming in at one temple only, which gave him a lopsided look, and he had brown eyes and a white scar through the tail of his right eyebrow from a horse's hoof, and he had a manner about him that people in Antelope Wells called unfriendly, and that was in fact something considerably sadder. Cassius Merrill had never been married. He was 38, and unmarried in a country where a man of means was generally spoken for by 25, and there were 4 or 5 theories about it in town, and every one of them was wrong. Here is the true one, and you need it now rather than later. Cassius Merrill's mother was named Ottilie, and Ottilie Merrill had married his father in Illinois in 1848 for 40 acres of bottom land, and had told her son so, not once. Continually, for 20 years, at the table and in the yard and over the wash, in 100 small remarks with the same barb in every one of them, that she had made a trade, that she had been young and poor and had sold what she had for what she needed, and that it had been the sensible thing, and that she did not regret it, and that his father had gotten the better end. Cassius Merrill had grown up in a house where the transaction was the weather. It was in every room. His father had known it and had spent 30 years being quietly, patiently grateful to a woman who despised him for accepting her, and Cassius had watched the whole of it from a child's chair at the end of the table and had made himself one promise at about 14 years old and had kept it for 24 years. The promise was this: he would never in his life buy a wife. So when I tell you that Cassius Merrill, at 38 years old, went to the land office in Antelope Wells in the second week of September, 1887, and posted a written notice offering marriage and a home-and-a-half interest in a deeded quarter section with a year-round spring on it, I want you to understand that he was breaking the one promise he had ever made himself, and that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that he did it anyway, and that he had a reason. They were married on the 4th of October in the front room of the Merrill house by a circuit preacher who had another wedding in Burns the next day and was in a hurry, with Emmett Tate standing up beside his sister with his jaw set like a man at a funeral, and Ozias Tate holding the ring, and a neighbor woman named Bonifacia Solano, who was 61 years old and had midwifed half that valley into the world, standing as witness because Josephine had nobody else. There was no cake. There was a supper afterward that Josephine cooked herself in her new kitchen because she did not know what else to do with her hands, and the terms, which they had settled at that table on the last Tuesday in September, were these: the Tate outfit would run its stock to Willow Spring from the 15th of June to the 1st of October each year, at no charge, in perpetuity, and it would be written into a filed agreement so that it survived either of them. Josephine would keep the Merrill house and books. The Tate boys would stay on their own place and work it, and Emmett would have the running of it in his own name at 21. And there would be separate rooms in that house until such time, and it was Cassius Merrill who wrote the phrase, and Josephine who read it 3 times, until such time as the wife should say otherwise, and never before, and it was never to be spoken of again by him in the interim. She had read that line 3 times, and then looked up at him and said, "Why?" And Cassius Merrill had said, "Because if I ask, you will say yes, on account of the water, and I would rather have a dry summer." And Josephine Tate had not had one word to answer that with, then or for a long while after. The first snow came the 11th of November, and the winter of 87 into 88 was the one the old men in that country talked about for 40 years afterward, and I am going to have to tell you about it, because everything these two people learned about each other, they learned between November and March with the wind screaming outside. Josephine Tate came into that house as a hired woman would, and worked like one, and for about 5 weeks Cassius Merrill let her. She scoured a kitchen that had been kept by a bachelor for 9 years. She found his books in a state that made her sit down, not dishonest, simply 4 years behind, a box of receipts and a ledger abandoned in 1883. And she asked permission and got it and spent 19 evenings reconstructing the whole of it, and at the end of it she came to him with a figure and said, "Mr. Merrill, you are $1,100 better off than you believe you are, and you have been paying interest on a note you settled in 85 because the bank never marked it and you never checked." And Cassius Merrill looked at that ledger for a long time and then said, "I have been running this place like a man with no reason to count." And Josephine said, "Well, count now." He taught her the country. That was his half of it. He put her up on a good horse in December and took her over every acre of those 640 and showed her the water, where the spring came out of the shelf and where the pipe ran and where the ice would take it if a man did not go up and break it, and how in a hard winter a spring can freeze from the outside in and choke itself, and how to know from the sound of it. He showed her the section corners and the old Paiute camp on the north bench that he did not run cattle over and never explained why. And she did not ask and never ran cattle over it either for 39 years. And they talked. Not much at first, and never about anything near the middle of them. They talked about grass and about the price of beef in Winnemucca and about a book of Cassius Merrill's father's that turned out to be a 2-volume set on drainage engineering, which Josephine read all of. And about the fact that neither one of them could sing, and about Ozias. Ozias Tate is where the ice broke, and I want to be exact about how it happened, because it was not a grand thing. The boy came up to the Merrill place 3 or 4 times a week that winter to see his sister, riding 2.5 miles in weather that had no business having a 14-year-old out in it. And he would sit in that kitchen and not talk, because the stammer had gotten worse since the funeral, and he had learned that the fastest way to avoid the humiliation was to be silent. He was silent in that kitchen for 6 weeks. And one evening in December, Cassius Merrill, who had watched the boy try 3 times to get out a word about a horse and give up, said, not gently, not kindly, just plainly over the top of his coffee-o's eyes, "Take the run at it again. I have got all night and nowhere to be." And the boy went scarlet. And he tried it again, and it took him about 40 seconds to get out a sentence about a bay gelding with a splint, and Cassius Merrill sat there through all 40 of those seconds without moving a muscle in his face and without finishing one word for him. And at the end of it he said, "Then we will pull his shoe in the morning and see," and got up and put his cup in the pan. That was all. But Josephine Tate stood at that dry sink with her back to the room and had to hold on to the edge of it, because she had spent 4 months watching every adult in Harnett County finish that boy's sentences for him out of pure kindness, and she had done it herself. and she had never once, until that minute, understood what it was doing to him. Ozias Tate came up 4 times a week after that, and then most days, and by February he was talking so much that Emmett threatened to walk him back on a lead rope. And by February that boy called Cassius Merrill by his first name and followed him around the barn like a dog and had a stammer that came out only when he was frightened, and he was not frightened very often anymore. And Josephine Tate lay awake in a separate room in that house and did arithmetic she had not agreed to do. I have to tell you what the town made of it, because a marriage like that one does not happen quietly in a country with 1,100 people in it and 1 street. Antelope Wells decided about Josephine Tate inside of a month. And what Antelope Wells decided was that she had sold herself for a spring. They did not say it that way. Nobody ever says it that way. What they said was that it was a very sensible arrangement, and that she had done well for herself, and that it was a mercy those boys would not lose the place, and they said it with a particular sort of smile, and every woman listening understood the whole of it. And so did Josephine. She heard it at the Mercantile in November. She heard it in the church porch in December from a woman she had known since she was 19, who said, "And how is your husband, dear?" Or ought I to say your landlord? And then laughed as though it were a joke, which is the oldest trick there is, because a woman who takes offense at a joke is a woman with something to be offended about. And here is the part that hurt. It was true. That is what made it unanswerable. She had ridden into that yard and said the words herself, out loud, in front of a witness, "I am marrying the water." Sir, and there was not one thing she could say to any of them that was not a lie or a confession. So Josephine Merrill did what proud women in small towns have always done. She went in on Saturdays with her chin level, and she paid cash, and she was polite to everybody, and she came home and did not repeat any of it to her husband. And she was so successfully composed about the whole thing that it took Bonifacius Solano until the 2nd week of January to work out what was happening, and about 40 minutes to put a stop to it. Bonifacius Solano was 61 years old, and had come up from Jalisco as a girl in 1849, and had buried a husband and 2 children in that valley, and had personally delivered something over 200 babies in Harney County, including, and this was the pertinent fact, including the eldest son of the woman who had made the joke on the church porch. Bonifacius Solano had no money and no land to speak of, and 60 head of cattle on 160 acres. And she had more standing in that country than the president of the Harney County Bank, and everybody knew it. On the 2nd Sunday in January, Bonifacius Solano came out of that church and took Josephine Merrill's arm in front of everybody and walked her down the whole length of that street to the wagons, talking the entire way about nothing whatever, about a hen, I believe, that had gone broody at an inconvenient season, and then stopped at the bottom, still holding her arm, and said, in a voice that carried a good deal farther than it needed to, "Josephine, on Wednesday my nephew brings his stock to the Willow Spring for the summer under an agreement your husband filed at the courthouse in October and would not take $1 for. My brother's outfit as well. And the Pardews." And then Bonifacius Solano said, "So when they tell you what you married, mija, you tell them to come and say it to me." Josephine Merrill did not know what she was talking about, not one word of it. She stood on that street with her arm in an old woman's hand and found out in about 9 seconds from a stranger that her husband had given away the water at his own spring to at least 4 other families and had not mentioned it to his own wife. She went home, and she did not ask him about it. I have thought about that a great deal. She had the thread right there in her hand, in the second week of January, 3 months before that courthouse, and she did not pull it, and the reason is the same reason she did not ask him about the dated notice in the drawer in March. Josephine Merrill was 31 years old and had spent 4 months watching her family's whole life get decided by other people, and she had come into that marriage having said out loud exactly what she was, and she had a horror of being caught wanting more than the terms. To ask him why he was quietly saving the valley would have been to admit that she was interested in the shape of his soul. And a woman who has announced that she came for the water does not get to go asking after a man's soul in January, not without conceding something. So she said nothing, and she was grateful, and she was ashamed of being grateful, and she went on being pleasant in that house through the coldest February in the history of that country. But she stopped minding the town, from about that Sunday onward. That is the thing Bonifacio Solano actually gave her, and it was worth more than the water. And when the town of Antelope Wells changed its mind about Josephine Merrill, which it did entirely in a single morning in April of 1888, in a courthouse in Burns, she found that she did not much care about that either. Now, the trouble came in 3 pieces, and the first piece came on the 20th of January. Thaddeus Coyne rode into the Merrill yard with 2 men. Coyne was 45, and he was the land agent for the Sagebrush Land and Cattle Company, and he was not a brute. I want to be careful here, because the brutes are easy, and Thaddeus Coyne was something worse. He was a pleasant, well-spoken, well-shaved man in a good gray coat who did arithmetic on other people's ruin and slept extremely well. He had already bought 4 outfits on the Silvies that way and had never once raised his voice at anybody. Coyne sat his horse in that yard and made his offer, and his offer was this: $1,100 for the whole Tate place. Stock and improvements and 1,100 acres, which was about 1/3 of what it had been worth in 1886 when there had been water on it. And he made it pleasantly. And when Josephine said no, Thaddeus Coyne said, "Mrs. Merrill, I understand entirely. But I would ask you to consider that your arrangement here rests on a spring, and that springs are a legal question, and that the state of Oregon has never in its history settled who owns the water that comes up out of a man's ground and runs off it. There is a case pending in Salem this very minute. If it goes one way, your husband owns Willow Spring. If it goes the other way, Willow Spring belongs to the whole drainage, and my company holds the senior right on that drainage by 11 years. He tipped his hat and said, "It would be a pity to find that out in August, ma'am, with 400 head on the ground." He was not bluffing about the case. That is what made it work. The second piece came in February, and it was the winter itself. It went to 31 below on the 9th and stayed under zero for 19 days. And they lost stock. Everybody in that country lost stock. And Willow Spring, which had never frozen in living memory, began to ice over from the rim in. And Cassius Merrill and Josephine Tate and a 19-year-old boy went up onto that shelf every single morning for 19 days at first light with bars and axes and broke it open by hand, and on the 14th of February the pipe froze solid underground, and they lost the flow entirely for 11 hours, and Josephine Merrill sat down in the snow beside a dead pipe and cried for the first time since her father's funeral, and Cassius Merrill did not touch her and did not tell her it would be all right. He sat down in the snow about 4 feet away and stayed there until she was done, and then he said, "Right, we will thaw it with hot rock and steam, and it will take us till dark." And it took them till 9 at night, and they got it. And the third piece came on the 2nd of March, and it was a piece of paper, and it did the most damage of the three. Josephine was clearing out a bureau drawer in the front room to make space for the reconstructed ledgers, and under a stack of old seed catalogs she found a folded sheet in her husband's hand. It was a draft. It was the draft of the notice he had posted at the land office in September, the notice she had answered, with 2 whole paragraphs crossed out and rewritten. The way a man writes when he is trying to get something exactly right, and it was dated the 29th of May, 1887. Her father had been buried on the 27th of May. Cassius Merrill had written that advertisement 2 days after the funeral, and had held it in a drawer for 3.5 months, and had walked it into the land office in September, 11 days, as it happened, after the Silvies River went dry. She did not confront him with it, not that day, and not for 11 weeks, and I want to tell you why, because it is the most human thing in this story. She was afraid of what it meant, and she was more afraid of what it did not mean. Look at it from inside her head. A man writes a marriage notice 2 days after your father's funeral. He puts it in a drawer. He waits until your creek dries and your position is desperate, and then, and only then, he posts it where you will see it. There is a reading of that which is tender past bearing, a man who wanted you, who would not approach a grieving woman, who waited and then made himself available in the only way he thought you would accept. And there is a reading of it that is very cold indeed, a man who saw a widowed family and a failing water supply and a valuable adjoining 1,100 acres, and who calculated the exact hour at which a proud woman could be had for a spring. And Josephine Merrill could not tell which one she was married to, and had no way on earth to ask him without telling him the thing she had not told anybody, which was that it had stopped being about the water somewhere around the middle of December, and she was ashamed of it. So she put the paper back under the seed catalogs and said nothing, and worked, and was pleasant, and lay awake. The thaw came in the 3rd week of March, and the water came down out of the mountains all at once, and on the 28th of March the Silvies ran bank to bank for the first time in a year, and every fool in that country was down at the crossings looking at it. And Ozias Tate, who was 14, and who had spent that winter becoming brave, took a shortcut across the lower ford on a green 3-year-old, and went into the water on the downstream side at 4 in the afternoon. It was Cassius Merrill who went in after him. He went in off the bank without taking his boots off, which is how men drown, and he got a hand on the boy's collar about 200 yards down where the channel bends against the basalt. And he got them both onto a gravel bar with a dislocated shoulder and his own head laid open above the scar he already had, and he could not get up the bank. It was Josephine who found them, because she had been half an hour behind on the road and had seen the horse come up riderless. And what she did with a 14-year-old boy blue to the lips and a 200-pound man who could not use his right arm and a bank she could not get a horse down, was to strip her own saddle, throw the cinch and latigo down as a line, put the boy up first, walk him a mile to the nearest house at the Solano place, and then go back for her husband in the dark and get him up that bank herself, with a rope around his chest and a horse she was leading by voice, 1 step at a time, for 40 minutes. Bonifacius Solano put the shoulder back that night on her own kitchen table with 3 people holding him and Josephine holding his head, and Cassius Merrill made a sound that Josephine Merrill heard for the rest of her life, and afterward, when the whiskey and the shock had him half under. He opened his eyes and looked up at his wife and said, quite clearly, "You came back for me." And Josephine said, "Of course I did." And Cassius Merrill said, "I did not expect it. I want you to know I did not expect it," and went out again. She sat with him all night. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, listening to that man breathe, Josephine Merrill admitted to herself what she had known since December, and made up her mind to tell him, and got the words in order, and that is where she was, with the words in order and her whole life about to change. When Thaddeus Coyne came to her 3 days later in Antelope Wells and put the second piece of paper in her hand, it was a certified copy of a deed, dated the 4th of June, 1887. It showed that the Willow Spring quarter section, 160 acres of basalt bench with the only year-round water between Antelope Wells and the mountains, had been sold on that date to Cassius Merrill by the Sagebrush Land and Cattle Company for $4,200. Thaddeus Coyne said, pleasantly, "I thought you ought to have it from me rather than from the courthouse. Mrs. Merrill, my company, owned that quarter for 2 years. Your husband bought it off us 8 days after your father was buried, at better than 3 times what it was assessed at in cash, and asked us particularly to keep the transaction off the wire. And I will tell you something else for nothing. He knew about the diversion dam. We had the survey done in April. He sat in our office in Winnemucca on the 2nd of June and looked at the plan of that dam on the table. And he knew exactly what was going to happen to the Silvies, and he bought the only wet ground in the valley 8 days after your father's funeral." Coyne folded his hands on his saddle horn. "You will draw your own conclusions, ma'am. I merely observe that a woman who marries the man holding the last water in a dry country is a woman who has been very neatly farmed." And that was the second cliff, and it was a bad one, because every single word Thaddeus Coyne said was true. Josephine Merrill rode 9 miles home with that deed in her coat and got down in her own yard, and Cassius Merrill came out of the barn with his arm still strapped across his chest, and she did not go in the house. She stood in the yard exactly where she had first sat a horse and told him she was marrying the water, and she said, "Did you know about the dam before you bought that quarter?" And Cassius Merrill stopped where he was, and he did not ask what she meant, and he did not ask who had told her, and he said, "Yes," she said, "before my father was in the ground?" And he said, 2 days before your father was in the ground. I was in Winnemucca on the 2nd of June, and I saw the plan on the table. I bought the Willow quarter on the 4th. I paid 3 times what it was worth, and I paid cash, and I asked them to say nothing about it. And Josephine Merrill said, "Why?" And here is where a lesser man says the beautiful thing. And Cassius Merrill did not say the beautiful thing, because his own mother had taught him what it sounds like when somebody explains their reasons in a marriage, and he had sworn he would rather be misunderstood than persuasive. What Cassius Merrill said was, "Because I could." And then he said, "Ask me the rest of it, Josephine. Ask me all of it. I will answer anything you put to me, and I will not dress up a word of it. But I am not going to stand in my own yard and argue you into a better opinion of me." And she did not ask. She was too angry and too frightened and too far in, and she turned around and walked into that house and did not speak to him for 9 days. 9 days is a long time in a small house. Those 9 days nearly cost more than a marriage, and I am going to tell you exactly how, because it is the closest this story comes to a real disaster, and because of what it showed her. On the 4th of those 9 days, Emmett Tate found out about the deed. He found out the way young men always find things out, which is sideways and secondhand and in the worst possible company. From 2 hands at the livery in Antelope Wells who had it from a clerk at the courthouse, and who were saying cheerfully over a horse's back that the Tate girl had been sold water by the same outfit that took her father's creek, and that Cassius Merrow had bought the spring-off sagebrush 8 days after old Nathaniel went in the ground. And had they not always said there was something about that man? Emmett Tate was 19 years old and had spent 11 months not being allowed to burn a dam. He rode up to the Merrill place at 9 o'clock that night with his father's rifle in a scabbard and got down in the yard and shouted for Cassius Merrow to come out of the house. And Cassius Merrow came out onto that porch in his shirt sleeves with his right arm still strapped across his chest from the river and no weapon of any kind, and did not say one word. And Josephine came out behind him and started to speak, and her husband said, very quietly without turning around, "No, this is his." So she stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides and let a 19-year-old boy scream at her husband in her own yard for the better part of 4 minutes. He called him a speculator. He called him a company man. He said his father had died, and 8 days later this man had bought the water off the same outfit that killed him and had waited for the creek to go dry and had put a notice up at the land office like a man baiting a trap and had married Emmett Tate's sister with it. He said, at the end of it, with his voice breaking the way it does at 19, "You bought her." And Cassius Merrow stood on that porch and took every word of it without one syllable of defense, and when it was over he said, "Is the rifle for me or is it for the dam?" And Emmett Tate said, "I don't know." And Cassius Merrow said, "Then put it up and come in the kitchen, because your sister has not spoken to me in 4 days on the same account. And if you two are going to hang me, I would rather you did it at the same sitting." They sat in that kitchen until 2 in the morning, and Cassius Merrow answered every question that boy put to him, flatly, without embellishment. Yes, he had known about the dam. Yes, he had bought the quarter 8 days after the funeral. Yes, he had paid cash and asked for it to be kept quiet. Yes, he had written the notice in May and posted it in September, and he knew what that looked like, and he was not going to argue about it. He did not mention the 11 agreements. Not once. Not to a 19-year-old boy with a rifle outside who would have gone out of that house and told the whole valley by Thursday and cleared his name for him. And Josephine Merrow sat at the end of her own table and watched her husband decline for 4 hours to save himself. I want to be careful about what happened in her that night, because it was not forgiveness, and it was not yet love, and it was more useful than either. Somewhere around midnight, she stopped asking herself whether Cassius Merrow was a good man, and started asking a different question, which was, what kind of man refuses the only defense he has got, in front of the 2 people whose opinion is the whole of his life? There is only one answer, and it is not innocence. Innocent men explain themselves, they cannot help it. The answer is a man who has decided that being believed on someone's terms is worse than not being believed at all. A man who watched his father spend 30 years explaining and being forgiven and explaining again, and Who would rather lose everything on a Tuesday than be married to a scorekeeper? Emmett rode home at 2 in the morning without his answer. He did not speak to his brother-in-law again until the courthouse 17 days later, and after the 6th of those 11 agreements was read into the record, he got up out of his seat in the back of that room and walked out into the corridor and was sick. And then he came back in. He apologized in June. He rode up and did it in the yard, standing in front of witnesses, because he had insulted the man in front of witnesses. And Cassius Merrill heard him out and then said, "You were the only person in this county who came and said it to my face. Do not ever apologize for that." And then he said, "The dam goes in 94 or it does not go. Leave it alone." And Emmett Tate, who was 20 by then, said, "Yes, sir," and left it alone. And the flood took it out 6 years later, and he told that story at his own table for 50 years. And on the 10th day, the thing broke open, and it broke open in the Harney County Courthouse in Burns, Oregon, on the 19th of April, 1888, at a hearing on the water right of the Silvies drainage that had been on the docket since the previous autumn, and that everybody in that valley had been waiting on the way you wait on weather. The Sagebrush Land and Cattle Company was there with 2 lawyers from Portland. The small outfits were there with 1 lawyer from Burns and no money. And the question in front of the referee was the one Thaddeus Coyne had put so pleasantly in January, whether a spring rising on deeded ground belonged to the man whose ground it rose on, or to the drainage as a whole under the senior appropriation of 1876, which the company held. And on the second morning of that hearing, Cassius Merrill's lawyer put in evidence, and what he put in was this. He put in the deed of the 4th of June, 1887, by which Cassius Merrill had bought the Willow Spring quarter from the Sagebrush Land and Cattle Company for $4,200 in cash, a document the company's own lawyers went white at the sight of, because a corporation that sells a piece of ground for 3 times its assessed value and takes the money cannot afterward stand up in a courtroom and argue that the water on that ground was never the seller's to sell. They had priced it as wet ground. They had banked the check. They had, in the plainest possible language, conveyed the spring. And then he put in the second document, and it was a filed agreement dated the 4th of October, 1887, the day of the wedding, granting the Tate outfit the perpetual right to water 400 head at Willow Spring from the 15th of June to the 1st of October in every year, running with the land, surviving both parties, recorded and stamped. And then he put in the third, which nobody in that courtroom had known existed, and it was 11 identical agreements, all dated between the 6th of October and the 2nd of December, 1887, granting the same perpetual summer water right at Willow Spring to 11 other outfits on the Silvies. The Solano place, the Pardue brothers, a widow named Egbert with 60 head. Every small outfit in that drainage that the Sagebrush Company had been waiting to buy at 1/3 of value in August. 11 of them, signed all through that autumn, and not one of those families had paid Cassius Merrill 1 cent, and not one of them had been asked to keep it quiet, and 11 of them had simply been told by a man they thought was unfriendly to bring their stock to the spring in June and say nothing about it and not make a fuss. The referee found for the deeded owner. He had no choice. The company had sold the ground and taken the money, and the Sagebrush Land and Cattle Company's whole position on the Silvies River came apart in a single morning, because you cannot dry out a valley whose stock has a filed and perpetual right to drink at a spring you sold, in writing to a man who gave the right away 12 times. Josephine Merrow sat in the third row of that courtroom and heard the whole of it, and by the sixth agreement she had stopped hearing anything at all. He had not bought the water to hold it over anybody. He had bought it to break the dam. She got him alone in the corridor outside that courtroom, and there were people going past, and she did not care. And she said, 11 families. And Cassius Merrow said, 12, counting yours. And she said, you never told me. And he said, it was not a thing to tell. It was a thing to file. And Josephine Merrow said, why did you not tell me in the yard? I gave you the chance. You said because I could. And Cassius Merrow said, because in that yard you were asking me to prove I was a decent man. And I have been in a marriage where one person had to keep proving and the other one kept score, and I would not do it. I would rather you find out in a courthouse than take my word for it in a fight. And then Josephine Merrow said the thing. She had not planned to say it there, in a corridor, with the door open and men filing out past them. But she had been carrying it since December, and it had been getting heavier every week, and it came out of her all at once. She said, Cassius, I only married you for the land. She said it the way a person confesses. Her voice went and her chin went, and she got it out and stood there in front of him, having finally told the truth she believed would end it, because she had spent 6 months in a house with a man whose own mother had married for 40 acres and had told him about it every day of his life, and Josephine Merrow believed, with her whole heart, that she had done to him the one unforgivable thing, and Cassius Merrow looked at her in that corridor. And he smiled, and I am told by people who knew him that it was the only time in his adult life anybody saw him do it with his whole face, and he said, Josephine, I only listed the land for you. She did not understand. He watched her not understand for about 3 seconds, and then he said the rest of it, and it was the longest speech of Cassius Merrow's life. He said, I wrote that notice on the 29th of May, 2 days after we buried your father. I had wanted to speak to you since a Sunday in '85 when you came out of the church at Antelope Wells and rubbed that crooked finger with your thumb while old Pardue talked at you about nothing for 11 minutes, and never once let him see you were bored. And I thought, there is a person with more patience than I will ever have. 3 years I did not speak to you. You had your father in your place, and you did not need one thing on this earth, least of all me, and I am not a man anybody picks out of a crowd, he said. And then, in June, I was in Winnemucca, and I saw the plan of that dam on a table, and I understood in about 4 seconds what was coming for every family on that river, and I understood something else that I am not proud of. I understood that it was coming for you, and that there would be a season somewhere out ahead when Josephine Tate would need something that I could get. And I bought that quarter 8 days after your father's funeral and paid 3 times its value in cash, and I told myself for 3.5 months that I bought it for the valley. He said, I did buy it for the valley. 11 families are watering there. But I had that notice written before I ever went to Winnemucca, and I did not post it in June when I could have, and I did not post it in July. I posted it 11 days after your creek went dry. And a man does not need a lawyer to tell him what that is. He said, so, you have got it backwards, and you have had it backwards for 6 months. And it has been eating you alive, and I did not know. You did not marry me for the land, Josephine. You married me for the water. And you told me so on a horse in my own yard before you would take a cup of coffee off me, which is the most honest thing anybody has ever done in my presence. He said, I am the one who put the land in front of you. I baited a hook with a spring for a woman I could not think of any other way to reach. I swore at 14 years old I would never buy a wife, and I did it anyway at 38, and I have been waiting 6 months for you to work it out and despise me for it. Now there is a version of this where she falls into his arms in that corridor, and it is over, and I have never liked that version. And neither did Josephine Merrow, who was 31 years old and had just been handed a piece of information that changed the shape of her entire year. What she said was, "Take me home." I want to say this in the yard. They rode the 9 miles from Burns mostly without talking, and it was the 20th of April, and the whole country was greening up in a way it had not greened in 2 years. And they came into the Merrow yard about 6 in the evening, and Josephine Tate Merrow got down off her horse, and then, because she wanted it exact, got back up on it. And from the saddle, in the yard, with the dust settling, she said this. She said, "Mist Merrow, last September I sat on this horse in this yard and told you I was marrying the water. I want to correct the record." She said, "You were right that I have had it backwards, but not the way you think. I have not been eating myself alive because I thought I wronged you. I have been eating myself alive because it stopped being the water somewhere around the middle of December. And I could not tell you because I had made myself a promise on this horse, and I did not think I had any right to change the terms once I had got what I came for. A woman who says she came for the spring and then goes soft in December looks like a woman who is paying for something. She said, I was not going to be your mother in this house. So I said nothing, and I lay awake, and I was going to say it the night Ozias went in the river, and then a man in a gray coat handed me a deed, and I lost my nerve for 3 weeks. And then she said, You have listed the land, and I have married it, and we are neither of us going to get out of that. So I am going to put a new thing on the table, and it is going to be the only clean thing either of us has done. And Josephine Merrow said, I am not asking you for water, and I am not asking you for a house, and I do not need 1 acre of you. Emmett has the running of the Tate place in his own name in 2 years, and I have $31 of my own, and I could walk out of here tonight and be all right, and I want you to know that, because it is what makes the rest of it worth anything. She said, Cassius, there is a line in our agreement about separate rooms, and it says until such time as the wife should say otherwise. And she got down off the horse, and she said otherwise they were married in law from the 4th of October, 1887, and they were married in every other way anybody means it from the 20th of April, 1888, and they had 39 years. Thaddeus Coyne left the Silvies country in the autumn of 1888. The Sagebrush Land and Cattle Company sold out its Harney County holdings in '91 at a loss and went into railroad timber in Washington. And Coyne went with it, and by every account slept perfectly well for the rest of his life, and never once understood what had happened to him, and would have told you until his dying day that he had merely been outmaneuvered on a technicality by a rancher, who got lucky with a deed. The diversion dam 11 miles up to Silvies stood until the flood of 1894 took the middle out of it, and nobody rebuilt it, and the river has run every summer since. Emmett Tate took the Tate place in his own name in 1890 and ran it for 51 years and never lost it. Ozias Tate went to the normal school at Monmouth on money his sister and her husband put up and never once called a loan, and came back and taught school at Antelope Wells for 34 years, and there are people buried in that valley who learned to read from a man with a slight hesitation in his speech, who would never in his life finish a child's sentence for them. Not once. Not if it took all afternoon. Cassius and Josephine Merrow had 2 daughters and a son. The son they named Nathaniel. The elder girl they named Ottilie, which was Josephine's idea and not his, and which she had to argue him into over the better part of a year, and her argument, I have always thought this was the best thing she ever said, was that a name is not a debt, and that it was time somebody in that family carried it who had chosen everything she had. They kept those 11 agreements alive their whole lives. When the Egbert widow died in 1902, her heirs tried to sell the water right off the land, and Josephine Merrow rode to Burns at 46 years old and stopped them in an afternoon. On the grounds that the right ran with the land and had never been Cassius Merrow's to sell in the first place, which is precisely what she and 11 other families had been counting on since 1887. Cassius Merrow died in 1927. Josephine Merrow lived until 1941 and ran the Willow Spring Quarter herself for the last of it, and was, by the end, the person the whole valley came to about water. And a thing that got handed down through the Tates and the Merrows and half the families on that river, and it is a story told at kitchen tables in Harney County to this day, by people who could not tell you the year, is not the courthouse, and not the 11 agreements, and not the dam. It is 2 sentences said in a corridor in Burns, Oregon, by 2 people who had each spent 6 months privately certain they were the one who had cheated. She said, "I only married you for the land." And he smiled, and he said, "I only listed the land for you." And they both stood there a moment and understood at the same instant that they had been in love with each other since before either one of them had a single thing to bargain with.